Delaney Mercer made it 3 blocks before her shoes betrayed her. The left sole had been worn through since summer, worn thin enough that she could feel the brick through the rubber, and on the wet leaf sidewalks of Olneyville, it slid out from under her a long way before she caught herself. She stumbled, one hand against the damp brick wall, the other going under her belly out of pure reflex. The rain wasn't heavy, just that stubborn November drizzle, enough to paste the gray-green uniform flat against her back. Behind her, a block back, 2 headlights swept along the wall of the abandoned textile mill. Slow, in no hurry at all, the kind of light that belongs to men who already know the road ahead doesn't go anywhere. She didn't look back, because every look back cost half a step, and she had no half steps left to spend. There was an alley cutting between the mill and the row of warehouses, one she'd walked hundreds of times on her way to the bus stop. And in that moment, her mind held exactly one thought. That alley comes out on Manton Avenue. She turned into it. A chain-link fence 10 feet high stood across the far end, padlocked, strung wall to wall. Someone had put it up on some day she hadn't been there to see. She got both hands into the wire and pulled. It didn't give. She looked up at how high it was, then down at her own belly. And in that moment she understood something very simple. Certain doors had closed to her months ago, and this was one of them. At the mouth of the alley, a black car pulled to the curb. Not the car whose headlights had swept the wall. This one was quieter, cleaner, and it stopped the way a car stops when it doesn't need to chase anybody. The door opened. A man stepped out into the rain, no umbrella, no hurry, and came to a stop directly in the middle of the only way out. He was tall, long, dark overcoat. The shirt cuffs beneath it turned back exactly twice despite the weather. The one working streetlight fell on him from behind, so she couldn't make out his face. Only a shape that sealed off the exit, hands loose at his sides, standing still as though he had all night to stand there. "What are you running from?" His voice was quiet. Quiet enough that the rain nearly swallowed it. Quiet enough that she had to hear the question twice inside her own head before it came together into meaning. But by then she wasn't hearing anything. She backed up until her spine met the chain link, the cold wire pressing through the wet fabric into her skin. She saw the black car. She saw shoes without a speck of mud on them. She saw the way the man stood, easy, not winded, with no intention whatsoever of running after her, because he didn't have to run after her anymore. For months now she had imagined this moment far too many times. The calls at midnight, the notes pushed under her door, the nights she walked 3 blocks out of her way to come home from a different direction. She had imagined it so often that when it finally arrived, her body knew what to do before her mind could object. Her knees went down onto the wet pavement. She brought her hands together in front of her chest, looked up into the drizzle, and her voice broke on the very first word. "Please don't hurt us." The man didn't move. "I've been paying. Every month I pay something. You can check. I write it all down. I write down every dollar." She spoke fast, the sentences climbing over each other, as though speaking fast enough might outrun whatever was coming. "I work 2 jobs. Nights at Waybosset, days at the laundry. I'm only asking for 2 more weeks. Whatever's in my place, take all of it. I won't tell anybody. I swear." She stopped to breathe, and both hands came away from her chest and folded down around her belly. "But please don't touch the baby. Please. She's all I've got." Plenty of people had knelt in front of Elias Bracco. They knelt in warehouses, in parking garages, in back rooms behind restaurants, and every last one of them had been begging for himself. This was the first time anyone had ever gone down on their knees in front of him to beg for someone who hadn't been born yet. The woman kneeling in the rain had no idea who she had just begged. Still less did she know that the man standing between her and the way out that night was the reason her husband never made it home. If this story reaches you, leave a like, leave a comment, share it with whoever comes to mind, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of the road with them. 6 hours earlier, when the city still hadn't turned off all its lights, Delaney Mercer swiped her badge at the employee entrance behind the Waybosset building and walked down the service corridor, where the smell of floor cleaner had clung to the walls for so long that no one noticed it anymore. She hung her coat on a hook, fastened the plastic badge to the front of her uniform, and before leaving the changing room, she did what she did every night. She smoothed the front of her shirt with one hand so it wouldn't cling too closely to her belly. That morning, she'd spent 2 hours in the waiting room at the Social Security office, filing an application for survivor benefits, and on the final line of the form, where it asked about the possessions the deceased had left behind, she'd written one simple, honest sentence saying that she still kept her husband's old phone as a memento. Then she'd signed her name, submitted the application, walked to the bus stop, and hadn't thought about it again. The night shift began on the 38th floor and worked its way down. She pushed a supply cart with one squeaking wheel, a wheel that had been squeaking since before she started working there and would still be squeaking after she was gone. And throughout the entire 42-story building, there was nothing but the sound of that wheel and the steady breathing of the air conditioning above the ceiling. She wiped down the desks of people she'd never met. She knew who kept family photographs on their desks and who didn't. She knew the person in the corner office on the 35th floor drank coffee without sugar and always left the paper cup standing neatly beside the trash can instead of dropping it inside. And for nearly a year, she'd wondered whether that was an act of courtesy or whether the person simply believed someone else had been born to pick it up. There was a large mirror covering the entire rear wall of the service elevator. She never looked at it. She stood slightly to one side, facing the panel of floor numbers, and held that position throughout every ride up and down, because there were evenings when she didn't have the strength to see a 27-year-old woman in a baggy uniform standing alone inside a metal box in the middle of the night. Halfway through the shift, Marisol Vega was waiting for her in the basement break room with half a sandwich resting on a paper napkin folded in two. She was 54 years old, had worked in the building longer than the manager, and her hand trembled faintly as she poured coffee from a thermos, the kind of trembling that came from holding a cleaning rag for too many years. "Eat, Lainey." She pushed the napkin across the table. "You eat your half. I'm not hungry. People who aren't hungry don't lean against the wall while they're cleaning windows." She didn't say anything else. She simply sat down across from Delaney and opened the thermos. In that entire building, Marisol was the only person who called her by name. To management, she was the 11th line on the shift schedule. To the people on the upper floors, she was the woman in the blue-gray uniform who pressed herself against the wall to let them enter the elevator. But to the woman sitting across the table, she was Lainey. And for the past 4 months, there had been nights when that was the only reason she could make herself leave the house. When she'd finished eating, she took the rubber-covered notebook from her pocket. Its 4 corners were worn, the elastic band around it had gone slack, and inside were numbers written in ballpoint pen, each one arranged in its proper column: 2 bus fares, a carton of milk, an installment on the electric bill. She recorded every last cent, not because she was afraid she might forget, but because it was the only part of her life she could still control. On the final page was another number, 1 she added up once a week, and every time she finished, she sat still for several seconds before closing the notebook. Marisol looked at the notebook, then at her, and didn't ask a thing. Her shift ended while it was still dark. She changed her clothes, put on her coat, and went down to the parking garage to leave through the rear exit, the route she took every morning to avoid the main lobby. There were 4 lights in the garage, and 2 of them had been broken since summer. She'd gone about 10 steps when she saw them. 2 men stood beside a concrete pillar near the exit, one leaning back against the pillar and the other standing upright. Neither of them doing anything at all. They didn't come toward her. They didn't call her name. They simply stood in the one place that made it impossible for her to pass without going around them, and they watched as she did. "You finish your shift at 6, right?" The man leaning against the pillar spoke in an even voice, as if he were asking when a train was due. 7 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because you take on 2 extra floors." She didn't stop. She kept walking, one hand tightening around the strap of her bag, and heard their shoes turn in the direction she was going. "We know which way you go home too," the other man said. "Even that route where you circle 3 extra blocks." No one touched her. Neither of them quickened his pace. But the distance between her and the exit seemed to narrow with every step, and by the time she understood that they had no intention of letting her leave through that door, she was only about 4 steps from the red sign marking the emergency exit. She threw her entire weight against the push bar. The door flew open, and the fine November rain struck her face like a cold slap. Behind her, she heard a car door close. There was no hurry in it, just one sharp, final sound, followed by the engine starting. The headlights swept across the mouth of the alley and stopped there, 2 bands of white cutting through the misting rain and casting the man's shadow long behind him, stretching back toward her. A car door opened. Then came the sound of shoes on wet pavement, 2 men walking slowly, moving with the measured rhythm of people who knew there was nowhere left to run. Delaney heard her own breathing before she heard anything else, and she covered her mouth with her entire hand. The man in front of her didn't turn toward the lights. He simply raised a hand and began unbuttoning his coat, doing it slowly, as though he were standing in a warm room, then slipped it from his shoulders and took exactly one step forward to drape it around her. The coat was heavy and still warm from his body. He drew the two sides closed over her chest, pulling them down until the thick fabric completely covered the curve of her belly beneath the wet uniform, and as he did it, he didn't look at her face even once. "Stand up. Get behind me. Don't say a word." He spoke softly, just loud enough for her alone to hear, then turned and stepped between her and the two beams of light. The other two men reached the middle of the alley, and one of them raised a flashlight. The beam traveled from his shoes all the way up to his face. It dropped so quickly that Delaney thought she might have imagined it. Mr. Bracco, standing behind him with both hands clutching the edges of his coat, she sensed the change in the alley before she understood what it meant. The two men had entered with the gait of hunters closing in on their prey. Now they straightened their backs, their hands falling naturally in front of their stomachs, and one of them had taken half a step backward, without seeming to realize he'd moved at all. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" "We were sent to find someone, sir." "Who?" The man holding the flashlight said a name. Delaney heard her own name echo between the two brick walls, the stress mangled and the syllables clipped, sounding more like the name of a missing package than that of a human being. The man standing in front of her let the name fall into the silence and didn't fill the space it left behind. Rain tapped against the roof of the car. No one in the alley dared to speak first. "There's no one here by that name," he said. "What's here is my car and one of my people. Go look somewhere else." There was no threat in his words. No one raised his voice. No one moved another step toward anyone else. And if someone had happened to pass the mouth of the alley at that moment, they would have seen nothing more than three men talking in the rain. But the other two backed away, apologized twice, and the way they turned showed that they'd made their decision the instant the flashlight illuminated his face. A car door closed. The headlights withdrew from the mouth of the alley, swept once across the brick wall, then disappeared in the direction of Manton Avenue, and the engine faded until all that remained was the sound of water running through the gutter. Delaney hadn't moved from where she stood. She was trembling, and she didn't know whether it was from the cold or something else, and the coat hung below her knees. He turned and took one step toward her. She shrank back, pressing herself against the wire fence. He stopped immediately. Then he did something very slowly and very deliberately. He extended both hands in front of him, palms turned upward, and held them there where she could see them. 3 steps away. "I'm not going to do anything to you." His voice was slower now than it had been before. "I just need you to listen to one sentence, and then I'll step back right away." She didn't answer. She didn't have enough breath to answer, but she didn't run again either, because there was a fence behind her and, in front of her, the man who had just lied so she wouldn't have to get into that other car, and caught between those two things, she didn't know which one frightened her more. The wind swept into the alley and made one side of the coat slip from her shoulder. Beneath it, under the only streetlight still burning, the plastic badge clipped to the front of her uniform gleamed with a wet sheen. He looked down at it. There was one brief moment, so brief that even she couldn't be certain she'd seen it, when the man became more still than he had been while facing those two beams of light. He didn't ask another question. He didn't finish the sentence he'd asked her to hear. He simply stood there in the rain, both hands still held out before him as he'd promised, his eyes resting on the plastic badge far longer than anyone needed to read 7 letters. And when he looked up again, something in his face had changed, though she couldn't have given it a name. "Come on," he said, turning toward the black car. "Where are we going?" "To your home. That's all." She sat in the back seat, pressed close to the door on the right, and her hand never left the door handle for the entire ride. The leather seat still held the warmth of the heater, and was so clean that she was afraid of leaving a streak of mud on it. So she drew both feet in and held them tightly together. The coat was still draped over her shoulders. She'd meant to give it back when she got into the car, but he'd closed the door before she could think of what to say. He drove slowly. He didn't ask her anything for the first 10 minutes, and when he finally spoke, he asked only one question. "Which way?" "Just keep going straight." She looked out the window, watching the darkened storefronts drift backward, and counted the intersections in her head, as though she were counting the rungs of a ladder leading down into a well. She didn't tell him the name of the street. She didn't give him a house number. At the 3rd intersection past the old church, while the light was still red, she spoke for only the 2nd time during the entire ride. "Let me out here. This isn't anywhere." "I know." He watched her in the rearview mirror for about 2 seconds, then pulled over without another word. She opened the door and stepped out, and only when she was standing on the sidewalk did she remember the coat. But he was looking straight ahead through the windshield, and she understood that if she took it off and returned it now, it would require 3 more sentences, and she didn't have 3 sentences left in her. She drew the 2 sides of the coat together and began walking east. She took the long way around, not because she was being careful, but because it was the route she always took. And over the past several months, her feet had learned that winding path better than the direct one. Elias didn't start the car right away. He left it parked at the curb with the headlights off, and waited until her figure had dwindled into a dark speck at the end of the block. Only then did he follow, keeping so far behind that even if she looked back, all she would see was another pair of headlights somewhere in the city. She turned left. Then she turned left again. She walked another 2 blocks and stopped in front of a 4-story red brick apartment building, the kind whose facade had faded long ago and whose owners repainted only the base of the walls whenever someone complained. There was no lobby. There was no elevator. There was only an iron staircase bolted to the outside wall, zigzagging from the sidewalk all the way to the 4th floor, and she climbed it with the practiced steps of someone who had climbed it every day for years. He watched her place her foot on the first step, then the second. When she reached the 3rd, the entire staircase shuddered, the vibration traveling through the iron frame with a sound loud enough to be heard from inside the car, and one corner of the step collapsed. A piece of rusted metal fell through the gap and struck the pavement below. She staggered. She seized the railing with both hands and stood perfectly still for about 3 breaths, one hand dropping to cradle her belly with the same instinctive motion he'd seen in the alley. Then she stepped over the broken place, carefully planting her foot close to the inner edge where the frame was still attached to the wall, and continued up to the 4th floor as if what had just happened weren't worth stopping for. She never once looked back down at the broken step. He understood immediately what that meant. People only failed to look back when they already knew something was going to break. A light came on in a 4th floor window, glowing yellow, then went out about 5 minutes later. Elias remained in the car. He sat there for a long time, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the rusted iron frame bolted to the red brick wall, at the jagged break in the middle of the 3rd step. At the 4 full stories, a pregnant woman had to climb up and down 4 times every day so she could work 2 shifts. He'd passed through hundreds of neighborhoods like this in his life, and not once had he ever stopped his car to look at a staircase. By the time he arrived home, the sky had faded to the pale gray that came just before dawn. He didn't turn on the main lights. He went straight into his study, stood beside the desk for a moment, then opened the bottom drawer on the left. Inside were several old documents, his father's broken wristwatch, and an envelope yellowed around the edges. He picked it up. Inside was a sheet of graph paper, the kind torn from a school notebook, folded into 4, its creases worn into white lines. The handwriting was neat, every letter carefully formed, written with the caution of someone who wrote slowly and was afraid of making a mistake. The letter didn't ask for the debt to be forgiven. It asked only for a 3-month extension, accompanied by a promise to pay everything in full, an explanation of the circumstances, and not a single sentence of complaint. At the bottom of the page, beneath the line of thanks, was a signature, Wesley Mercer. He'd read the letter exactly once, 4 years earlier, on some busy afternoon he could no longer remember. Then he'd folded it, put it away in the drawer, and done nothing. He stood there in the darkened room with the sheet of graph paper open in his hands, and he said nothing. That afternoon, he sat in his office on Dorrance Street, his right hand still wrapped in cloth tape, with an apple and the small knife he always kept in his desk drawer resting in front of him. He'd called Sal Kettering that morning and given him a single task: pull every loan record bearing the Mercer name, every receipt, every signature, including the pages that had been transferred into the new ledger. Kettering had said it would take a few hours. Elias wasn't accustomed to waiting. While he waited, his secretary brought in a thin file on Ronan Whitlock, the foundation contractor for the refrigerated warehouse complex near the port, who had signed 2 contracts for the same quantity of concrete the month before and pocketed the difference, then blamed it on a 26-year-old engineer who had only just entered the profession when questions were raised. Elias finished reading the entire file before he'd peeled halfway around the apple. He didn't call Whitlock. He called Delia Fenner at the Concrete Workers Union, and the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He asked after her mother. He asked how work had been that season. Then he told her there was a name on the contractor list that was running 3 job sites for Whitlock at the same time while carrying insurance for only one, and that he thought the union ought to know before the newspapers did. Fenner remained silent for exactly 3 beats. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Nothing at all. Just do your job." He hung up. The apple peel still hadn't broken. His second call was to a man named Aldridge at the city building permit office, someone he hadn't called in nearly 2 years, and that conversation was even shorter than the first. He gave him a file number. He said the inspector's signature on the foundation approval for Lot B belonged to a man who had been retired since spring, and he thought it would be better for the city to send someone down to inspect it than to let a refrigerated warehouse floor reveal the truth for itself one day. Aldridge asked whether he wanted the informant's name kept confidential. "What information did I give you?" he said. "I was only calling to see how you were." By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the foundation contract had been suspended. By nightfall, the union had issued a notice temporarily suspending Whitlock's contractor status, and his remaining 3 job sites lost their workers at the same time. Before the week was over, he would knock on every door in the city and discover that none of them opened anymore, not because anyone had forbidden it, but because everyone had understood on their own. No one would come looking for him. No one would lay a finger on him. He would simply disappear from the list people called when they needed a foundation poured. And that was the only method Elias Bracco had used in years, because it was clean. It left no marks, and it made people understand more quickly than anything else could. He finished peeling the apple. The long strip of peel, whole and unbroken, dropped onto the sheet of paper spread across the desk. He cut off a piece and ate it, and in the silence, he realized that he'd just erased a man's entire career on the very afternoon he was sitting there, waiting to learn how much money a woman still owed. He hadn't seen any difference between the two things until he thought of her hand holding out his coat that morning, neatly folded, unwilling to accept anything from a stranger. The phone vibrated on the desk. Kettering. Elias answered and wedged the phone against his shoulder, the knife still in his hand. "Are you finished?" The man on the other end didn't answer immediately. Elias heard papers turning, then a chair scraping backward, then the man clearing his throat in the way of someone trying to decide whether he should say what he'd just discovered. "Mr. Bracco," Kettering said, "I checked it 3 times. I checked the old ledger and the one transferred last year. And that loan under the Mercer name." There was another silence, longer this time. "There's no debt left on it. It was paid off a long time ago." Elias set the knife down on the desk. "Say that again." "The loan was paid in full before Wesley Mercer died, sir." "Before, not after." Outside the window, the lights along Dorrance Street came on all at once. He sat perfectly still, staring at the strip of apple peel coiled on the paper, and in his mind, he saw a rubber-covered notebook he'd never laid eyes on, where a woman had spent the past 4 months recording every last cent so she could repay a debt that no longer existed. Sal Kettering arrived at the office shortly before 9 o'clock that night, carrying 2 cardboard boxes and wearing the expression of a man who had walked 3 blocks, trying to decide how to begin. He'd kept the Bracco family's books since Elias's father's time, was 61 years old, wore bifocals, and in all those years, he had never brought records to the office himself instead of calling. He set the first box on the desk and took out 3 bundles of receipts tied with string. "You'd better see for yourself." Elias opened the first bundle. The original loan had been for $12,000, signed more than 4 years earlier, and the reason listed on the document was the medical expenses of an inpatient named Mercer, not Wesley, but his mother. The borrower had paid steadily every month without missing a single one. The payments were small, but they were never late, and the final receipt bore a faded red stamp reading "paid in full," along with the collector's signature and a date from nearly 4.5 years earlier. Elias stared at that date for a long time. Wesley Mercer had died 4 months ago. That meant the man had paid off his debt, and then lived for another 4 years. It meant that throughout those 4 years, and for all 4 months after his death, someone had continued knocking on the door of that 4th-floor apartment to collect money for something that no longer existed. "Whose signature is that?" Kettering didn't answer. He simply opened the second bundle and pushed it across the desk. It wasn't a company ledger. It was a black hardcover notebook, the kind sold at a grocery store, and inside were dense columns of handwriting, 1 name on each page, 1 collection on every line, all written by the same hand. Elias turned the pages one by one. 19 names. He read every one of them in silence, and the more he read, the more the room seemed to close in around him. An 82-year-old woman in Silver Lake charged $120 every month for 3 years. A man who had been unable to work since an accident at a machine shop. A widow in Pawtucket. Another widow near the port. Then another. 11 of the 19 names belonged to women who had lost their husbands. 4 more were over 70. And not one of those names, not a single one, belonged to the kind of person who could knock on a lawyer's office door or walk into a police station and be offered a chair. They had been chosen carefully. That was what sent a chill through him, not the money itself. Someone had sat down with the organization's list of former borrowers and selected precisely the people who would never ask questions, the people who had no one to call, the people whose cries wouldn't be heard even if they raised their voices. On the 14th page was the name Delaney Mercer, and beside it were 4 collections, each month showing a different uneven amount, one of them only $25. Elias stared at that $25 longer than he had stared at the red paid in full stamp. Where did this notebook come from? The secondary safe beneath the port warehouse. I went down to retrieve the old records and found it stored with the fuel ledgers. Kettering took off his glasses, cleaned them, then put them back on, his way of buying time. Mr. Bracco, I've worked here for 30 years. I'm not foolish enough to make a careless guess. Say it. I've seen this handwriting once a week for the past 20 years. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. A long silence filled the room, and during that silence, Elias didn't feel anger. The anger would come later, much later, on another night. What he felt in that moment was something stark and very clean, the feeling of a man who had just discovered that an entire row of supporting columns beneath the floor he'd stood on for years had been removed long ago without his knowledge, while he'd continued walking across it every day, confident and unsuspecting. He closed the black notebook and rested one hand on its cover. Who else knows about this? Only me. I haven't told anyone. Keep it that way. Kettering nodded and rose, but when he reached the door, he stopped. That Mercer woman, he said without turning around. During the past 4 months, there was 1 month when she paid $25. Do you know what paying $25 means? It means that was all she had in her home that day. Then he left. Elias remained alone with the 2 cardboard boxes and the black notebook beneath his hand. He'd intended to call her that very night. He'd taken out his phone, opened the number he'd had someone obtain from the Waybosset Building's personnel records, and stared at it for about a minute. It would take only 10 seconds to say it. She didn't owe anyone a single cent. She never had, and the past 4 months had been nothing but extortion. But if he told her now, she would ask who had taken her money. Then she would ask how he knew. Then she would ask who he was in all of this. And he had no answer to the third question that wouldn't bring the first 2 crashing down with it. He turned off the screen and placed the phone face down on the desk. He told himself he would tell her, just not yet. Not until he'd cleaned up everything on his side first. Later, when he looked back, he would understand that this was where he made his greatest mistake, and that he'd repeated exactly what he'd done 4 years earlier, with a sheet of graph paper folded into 4. He had learned something important, and decided to leave it lying in a drawer for a little while longer. He summoned them on Thursday morning, to the room above warehouse number 4 near the port, where his father had once sat, and which had been opened only 3 times since his death. The long wooden table in the center of the room dated back to those days, its surface covered in scratches running in every direction, and 7 men sat along its 2 sides, in an order no one needed to arrange. Elias sat at the head of the table near the window. No one stood behind him. That was the first thing the men in the room noticed, and it was what made 2 of them uneasy before he even opened his mouth, because in that room, there was only one reason a man wouldn't need anyone standing at his back. Outside the window, a crane was lowering containers into the yard, and the clash of steel against steel echoed at steady intervals like the ticking of a clock. He didn't greet them. He didn't ask about business or inquire after anyone. He simply placed a black hardcover notebook on the table, the kind sold at a grocery store, its spine bent from being stuffed into a coat pocket too many times. He didn't open it. He left it lying there in the middle of the table, where the light from the window fell across it, and sat in silence. 6 men looked at the notebook. 1 didn't. Roy Faulkner sat on the right, 3 chairs away from Elias, his hands clasped over his stomach, his eyes fixed on Elias's face from the moment the notebook touched the table. He was sucking on a mint. Everyone could hear it rolling around inside his mouth, and in that silence, the sound seemed louder than the crane outside. Elias rested one finger on the notebook's cover. "There are 19 names in here," he said. "I'm going to read one." He still didn't open the notebook. He didn't need to. Delaney Mercer. The name fell upon the wooden table and lay there in the silence. No one asked him to repeat it. No one frowned. No one turned to look at the man beside him, and that reaction told Elias more than any confession could have. Because when 7 men heard an unfamiliar name, at least one of them should have looked confused. No one in that room did. The third man on the left was Cormac Ridley, who oversaw several restaurants on Atwell Street, and the thumb of the hand he had resting on the table began to tremble faintly, the kind of trembling a person couldn't conceal, because it came from somewhere beyond the reach of his will. Elias saw it. He said nothing about it. He sat upright, both hands resting on his thighs beneath the table, and his voice remained as quiet as it always was, so quiet that the 4 men seated at the far end had to lean forward to hear him clearly, and every one of them leaned forward. There are rules in this house. We lend money, people pay us back, and once the debt is settled, it's over. No one knocks on their door again. He paused. Someone in this room collected money from a woman who didn't owe anyone a single cent, for 4 months. 1 month all she could give was $25. Outside, the crane finished lowering a container and fell silent. Whoever put his hand into someone else's pocket will stand up now. If you stand now, all you lose is your job. I won't ask a second time, and I won't go looking. I already have the notebook. No one moved. Elias counted slowly to 10 in his head, allowing the silence to stretch beyond what an ordinary person could endure. At the 12th second, Cormac Ridley pushed back his chair and stood. He said nothing, and looked at no one. He simply stood there with his arms hanging at his sides and his face drained white. 3 seconds later, the man sitting at the far end on the right, a younger man responsible for several collection points in Silver Lake, rose as well, and he was trembling visibly. "Go to the car. Wait for me outside." The 2 men left. The door closed. 5 men remained in the room, and now 4 of them stared down at the table, while one continued looking directly at Elias and sucking on the same mint. Faulkner smiled. It wasn't a strained smile or the smile of a man being cornered. It was the smile of a man watching the very play for which he'd bought his ticket long ago. "Very good," Faulkner said. "Your father used to do exactly the same thing, at this same table, with no one standing behind him." He removed the mint from his mouth, wrapped it in its foil, and placed it neatly at the edge of the table. "But you forgot to ask one thing, Elias." "What?" "You counted 19 names in that notebook," he said slowly, and no one in the room was breathing anymore. "Would you like to know who left it in that safe, beside the fuel ledgers, in the exact place where a 61-year-old accountant would have to bend down before he could see it?" Elias didn't answer. Faulkner stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and the way he rose wasn't that of a man whose name had just been called. It was the manner of a man bringing a meeting he himself had summoned to an end. "You think you just uncovered a ledger," he said as he walked behind the 4 men with their heads lowered. "All you did was pick up exactly what someone wanted you to pick up." Then he left the room with the door standing open, and the sound of his shoes descending the iron staircase came at steady intervals, like someone counting down. Every Sunday, he went home to Federal Hill, and it was the only thing in his life he had never allowed work to make him miss. Antonia's house stood at the bottom of a short hill, with a narrow front and kitchen windows facing south, so from the middle of the morning until well past noon, a band of sunlight always stretched across the dining table. She was 71 years old and still cooked for the whole family in the cast-iron pot she had brought with her from across the ocean, a pot so heavy that she now had to drag it across the stove instead of lifting it. She never asked her son what he did for a living. In all those years, the only question she asked him every Sunday was whether he was eating enough, and the only answer he ever gave was that he was eating enough, Ma. That day, Rosalind was in the kitchen, with her sleeves rolled high, chopping vegetables beside her mother-in-law, while Toby sat on the floor near one leg of the table with a book about sharks spread open across his knees. He was 8 years old, with sandy curls, one missing front tooth, and a baseball cap he'd worn backward since the moment he entered the house. He was explaining to his grandmother why the great white shark wasn't the most dangerous species, and she nodded as she stirred the pot, as though this were the most important thing she'd heard all week. "Toby, get Grandma the button box from the top of the cabinet," she said. "The blue tin. I need to sew the collar button back on your uncle's shirt." "I can't reach it, Grandma. There's a stool." Rosalind said without taking her eyes from the cutting board. Use the little one, the wooden stool by the door. Elias stood leaning against the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the boy drag the low wooden stool over, climb onto it, brace both hands against the edge of the cabinet, and then reach up. He managed to reach the box. He almost managed to hold on to it, too, but the lid of the tin had been loose for longer than anyone could remember, and as the boy turned to climb down, it sprang free. The entire box tipped over, and more than 100 buttons of every color poured onto the kitchen tiles with a sound like hail striking a metal roof. Buttons rolled everywhere. They rolled beneath the cabinets, all the way to the doorway, and between Antonia's feet as she stood beside the stove. There were several seconds of silence. Then Antonia laughed first, the loud, raspy laugh of an old woman who had lived through enough to know what deserved to be called a disaster, and what didn't. Rosalind began laughing with her, and Toby sat on the stool looking down at the floor covered in buttons before he started laughing too, the way children laughed when they'd just realized they weren't in trouble after all. That box has had a broken lid since your uncle was a boy, Antonia said as she wiped her hands. Just leave them there. I'll sweep them up later. The boy didn't leave them there. He climbed down from the stool, knelt on the floor, and began picking them up. He collected them one at a time, dropping each one into his left palm, and when his hand was full, he crawled over to the tin, emptied them inside, then began crawling again. He even squeezed under the cabinets to retrieve the ones that had rolled beneath them. Toby, get up, sweetheart. Let Mommy do it, Rosalind said. I spilled them, the boy said without looking up, his voice as calm as it had been when he was talking about sharks. If I spilled them, I have to pick them up properly. Then he continued, and no one said another word. Antonia turned back to the pot. Rosalind shook her head with a smile and picked up her knife to finish chopping the vegetables. The sunlight still stretched across the table, and the only sound left in the kitchen was the soft clatter of buttons falling into the tin, one at a time, steady and unhurried. Elias remained where he was in the doorway. He didn't set down his coffee. He didn't step forward to help. He simply stood there, watching the small curve of the boy's neck bent toward the kitchen floor. And without warning, he saw the long wooden table at the port warehouse on Thursday morning, the black notebook lying in the center of a band of sunlight, and the 19 names he'd read in silence the night before. He had spent 4 years avoiding the thought of a sheet of graph paper folded into 4 and left inside a drawer. 4 years, filled with every excuse, every obligation, every busy afternoon. And an 8-year-old child had just spoken that same truth in less than 10 seconds, in the middle of a sunlit kitchen, without having any idea what he'd said. I'm finished. Toby stood and handed the tin to his grandmother. But I think a few rolled under the stove. I couldn't reach them. That's all right. Grandma has plenty of extra buttons. Antonia stroked his hair. Go play in the yard. Dinner won't be ready for a while. The boy grabbed his shark book and ran out the back door, his baseball cap still turned backward. The door slammed shut. Antonia waited until the sound of his footsteps had carried all the way into the yard, then turned to look at her son, and hers was no longer the face of an old woman who had just been laughing. Elias, she said. Sit down. There's something I need to ask you. He arranged to meet her at a small diner on Broadway Street in the middle of Monday afternoon. It belonged to someone he knew, and was nearly empty at that hour, and he chose the last table by the window so she could sit on the outside, close to the exit. She arrived on time, still wearing the clothes from her daytime job at the laundry, her hair tied up, and she didn't remove her coat when she sat down. She didn't touch the cup of hot tea they brought her either. You said there was something you needed to tell me. There is. He placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward her. Its edges had yellowed, and she studied it for about 2 seconds before picking it up. What is this? Open it. She drew out the sheet of paper and unfolded it along its 4 old creases. Slowly, the way someone opened something that had been folded for so long they were afraid it might tear along the lines. Then she looked down. He was about to continue. He'd prepared several sentences on the way there, simple sentences without evasion. This letter had arrived at his office 4 years earlier. He'd read it once and put it in a drawer. He'd done nothing, and that had been his fault. He managed to say the first sentence. He hadn't finished the second when he saw her 2 hands, holding the sheet of graph paper, begin to stiffen. They weren't trembling. They had gone rigid. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the paper and stopped there, perfectly motionless, while her face didn't lose its color so much as simply cease to function. like a door that had just been closed from the inside. "You said this letter was in your drawer," she said. "For 4 years." "Yes. Did you read it?" "I did. Once." She looked up. Now there was something in her eyes he hadn't anticipated, because he'd prepared himself for anger, for contempt, even for her to throw the cup of tea in his face, but he hadn't prepared himself for this look. "Wesley couldn't have written this letter," she said. He didn't understand. "The signature at the bottom is his. That part is real." He practiced signing his name until it looked right. He practiced on scrap paper for an entire month. Her voice remained steady, far too steady. But he couldn't write this letter. He read very slowly. He left school after the 10th grade, and he was ashamed of it his entire life. So ashamed that whenever he had to fill out any paperwork, he always asked me to go with him. She set the paper on the table, turned it toward him, and pointed to the first line. "This is my handwriting." Outside the window, a bus stopped and then pulled away. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes striking one another. Elias couldn't speak. "I sat at my kitchen table and wrote this," she said. He sat across from me and dictated it. He went over every sentence again and again, changing it several times, and made me take out the word beg, because he said we'd borrowed the money and we would repay it, so we weren't begging anyone for anything. I copied it 3 times so it would be clean. I bought that envelope at the corner store for 45 cents. Then he took it to mail himself because he didn't want me to have to go. She drew a breath, and her voice broke exactly once, in the middle of the next sentence. "He told me they would read it. He said if we wrote it properly, they would read it properly. I told him not to get his hopes up. He hoped anyway. He waited for an answer to that letter for nearly a year, and every month he checked the mailbox before I did." She fell silent for a moment. "For the past 4 years, I've believed that letter got lost." Elias opened his mouth. He didn't know what he intended to say, and fortunately for him, he didn't have time to say it, because she continued first. "Do you understand what you've just told me?" she said. "That night in the alley, I went down on my knees in front of you. I thought that was the first time I'd ever had to beg you for anything." She looked down at the paper lying between them. "It turns out I begged you 4 years ago. I sat in my kitchen, wrote it in my own hand, and copied it 3 times so it would be neat. And when you finished reading it, you put it in a drawer." No one in the diner looked toward them. "My husband paid off the debt before he died. Did you know that?" she asked, and her gaze moved across his face before coming to a stop. "You already knew." He didn't deny it. "How long have you known?" He remained silent, and the silence itself was the answer, and they both knew it. She nodded very slightly, a nod meant for herself rather than for him. Then she raised a hand to her chest, removed the plastic badge still clipped there, and placed it on the table beside the sheet of graph paper, its lettering facing upward. "You read this name the night you stood in front of me," she said. "And you read the name beneath that letter 4 years ago. You read both of them. You just didn't do anything about either one." She stood and drew the sides of her coat together. "Thank you for repairing the staircase. As for everything else, don't come back." She walked out. She didn't turn around. The diner door closed behind her. The small bell hanging above it gave a single chime and fell silent, and on the table remained an untouched cup of tea, a sheet of graph paper lying open beneath the afternoon light, and a plastic badge bearing 7 letters. He returned to his office on Dorrance Street that same afternoon and began making calls. The first was to Desi Vaughn, who oversaw several locations near the port and had worked for his father since the days when he made deliveries by bicycle. Elias told him plainly that he needed Roy Faulkner removed from every position by the end of the week, that all his access to the safes, warehouses, and ledgers had to be revoked, and that he wanted 2 men stationed outside Faulkner's office beginning the next morning. Desi remained silent longer than necessary. "Let me ask a few people about this first. I didn't ask you to consult anyone. I told you to do it, Mr. Bracco." His voice softened, and within that change was something Elias had never heard from the man in 20 years. "Things are different now." The second man didn't answer. The third answered and said yes several times, but by nightfall, there was still no one stationed anywhere. The fourth, a man Elias had promoted from a parking attendant 3 years earlier, spoke more plainly than the other 3. He said he had a wife and children, and asked permission to stay out of this. By 9 o'clock that night, Elias stopped calling. He remained alone in the room with 3 glass walls, the ceiling lights turned off and only the desk lamp burning, while beyond the windows, Streetlights stretched in a long line toward the port. He didn't smash anything. He didn't shout at anyone. He simply sat there and performed a very simple calculation in his head, counting every name in his organization and dividing them into 2 columns. And when he finished, he discovered that the column on the other side was longer than his own. Faulkner hadn't seized his authority during the past week. Faulkner had been standing there for years, patiently and systematically placing his people into one position after another, while Elias sat in his glass office signing papers and believing that the silence in every meeting room came from respect. He'd misunderstood what that silence meant. They were silent because they were waiting. Near midnight, someone knocked on the door, and Sal Kettering entered, still wearing the same old coat and carrying a document case beneath one arm. "I heard you made a lot of calls this afternoon." He set the case on the desk. "So I thought it was time you saw this." Inside were the original records from the expansion of the lending operation 4.5 years earlier, complete with meeting minutes and capital allocation documents. Elias turned to the final page and looked down at the approval signature. It wasn't his. It belonged to Angelo Bracco. "I know," he said. Kettering sat in the chair across from him. "How long have you known?" "Since I came back." That season, Elias had been across the ocean, taking his father's ashes back to the old man's homeland according to his wishes, and the trip had lasted more than 2 months because of the paperwork. Angelo had stayed behind to look after everything. By the time Elias returned to Providence, the operation had already been running for 6 weeks. The ledgers had been opened, the employees hired, and the money had left the safes and was circulating through the streets in the hands of hundreds of people whose faces he didn't know. He remembered very clearly the night he sat with his brother in this very room, the file open on the desk exactly as it was now, and told him, "This thing is going to eat people alive, Angelo." His brother told him the family owed money in 3 different places, that without this source of income, they would have to close 2 of the yards and the workshop near the port within 6 months, leaving more than 200 people without jobs, nearly half of them from Federal Hill. Angelo asked whether he had another way. Elias didn't. He sat in that room in silence for a very long time, and in the end, he closed the file, pushed it back toward his brother, and said only, "All right, keep it running." He didn't sign. His signature didn't appear on a single document in the entire file, and for 4.5 years, he had clung to that detail as if it were a handrail. Every time anyone mentioned the lending operation, he reminded himself that he hadn't signed anything, but he could have stopped it that night. He was the only person in the family who could have stopped it, and he had chosen not to. 3 weeks after that conversation, Angelo died in a car accident while returning from the port. The man who called Elias with the news shortly before dawn was Roy Faulkner. Elias remembered his voice on the phone that night. Faulkner spoke slowly, with sorrow in all the right places, and didn't waste a single word. He was the first person to arrive at Antonia's house the following morning. He handled most of the funeral arrangements. He was the man who supported the old woman as she left the church, and for the next 4.5 years, he was the one who poured Elias's coffee every Monday morning. Elias sat for a long time with the file open before him. Kettering said nothing more. He simply remained there. Outside, nearly all the city's lights had gone dark. Elias had always believed his guilt lay in a signature that, as it turned out, didn't exist. Now he sat in his own office with no one left to command, and understood that what he'd done was worse than signing his name. He had known. He had looked directly at it, and he had allowed it to continue, every day, for 4.5 years, until the machine finally ground its way to a slow-reading welder in Olneyville, a man who had asked his wife to write a letter for him and send it to this desk. Her badge wouldn't work on the 38th floor. Delaney tried it a second time, more slowly, pressing its face flat against the reader the way people did when a battery was weak. But the small light continued flashing red. She tried the stairwell door at the other end of the corridor. Red again. She stood there for about 10 seconds with the badge in her hand, and during those 10 seconds, she managed to think of 3 ordinary explanations. A system malfunction, an expired badge, someone pressing the wrong button. The human mind always exhausted every comforting explanation before it allowed itself to face the one that remained. Then she looked up at the service elevator display. It had stopped in the basement. It didn't move. She pressed the call button, and the button didn't light up. She stood in the middle of the corridor on the 38th floor with the supply cart whose one wheel squeaked, and for the first time in nearly a year of working in that building, its silence felt different from every other night. She took out her phone. There was 1 bar of service. She sent Marisol 3 words. "Where are you?" The message remained there with a circle spinning endlessly beside it. She walked along the corridor toward the emergency exit at the western end. That door didn't require a badge because fire safety laws required it to open from the inside. And it did. The stairwell was dark, illuminated only by a green emergency light at each landing. She descended 3 floors before stopping. There were people below. It wasn't the sound of footsteps coming up. It was the sound of someone standing in one place, shoes turning against concrete as a person shifted his weight from one foot to the other, followed by a dry cough. Then a man's voice told someone farther away to stay where he was because there was no reason to climb up. She stood motionless on the landing of the 35th floor, one hand gripping the railing and the other resting on her belly, and she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. She thought about climbing to the roof. She thought about breaking something to set off the fire alarm. She thought about sitting down right there and waiting until morning, until the day shift arrived, until there were people around, and she had almost decided to do exactly that. Then, she remembered the garbage cart. The night cleaning crew never took the trash down in the service elevator after midnight because the same elevator had to carry supplies to the kitchen on the ground floor, and because Marisol had taught her during her first week that the security guards complained whenever they used it. They took another route. On the 9th floor, there was an unnumbered steel door, painted the same color as the wall. It opened into a utility corridor that ran alongside the air conditioning pipes and connected to the neighboring office building where the backs of the 2 structures met. That door wasn't part of the badge system. It had a manual latch, and its lock had been broken for years. Every night, the cleaning crew pushed the garbage carts through it to reach the shared collection area behind the buildings. The door didn't appear on the map posted in the lobby. No one across all 42 floors knew it existed except 6 people in blue-gray uniforms and a maintenance man who had retired. She took off her shoes. Holding them in one hand, she descended 1 step at a time in her socks, placing each foot close to the inner edge where the concrete made the least sound, just as she did on the iron staircase outside her apartment. 26 floors. She counted the landings in her head and nothing else, refusing to let herself think about anything except the next number, because she knew that if she allowed her mind to wander for even a second, her knees would give way. The men below remained in the same place, somewhere near the 2nd or 3rd floor, neither coming up nor going down. When she reached the 9th floor, she pushed open the stairwell door, followed the darkened corridor, and found the steel door painted to match the wall by running one hand along the surface until her fingers touched the latch. It gave a sharp, dry click. Inside, the passage was hot and narrow and filled with the hum of machinery, loud enough to swallow every sound a person could make. She walked nearly 200 steps through it, bending at the places where the pipes hung low, and emerged on the other side into the emergency stairwell of another building, one where she had never worked and where no one had ever monitored the rear exit. She reached the back alley while it was still dark. She put on her shoes, leaned against the brick wall, and breathed. Above her rose 42 illuminated floors of glass, the building where she cleaned more than 4,000 square feet of flooring every night, and somewhere on the 38th floor, the supply cart with the squeaking wheel remained standing in the middle of the corridor. No one had come to save her. No one had called. No one had rushed to her, and no one had known she was there. The only thing that got her out of the building that night was an unnumbered steel door no one in the entire city had ever bothered to notice, because it was meant only for the people who pushed the garbage. She reached her 4th floor apartment after dawn had begun to break, locked the door, wedged a chair beneath the handle, then sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't get up again. She remained there until the sunlight moved from the edge of the window to the base of the refrigerator, and throughout all that time, she did only one thing. She tried to understand what had just happened to her. People didn't shut down the badge system of a 42-story building over $25. They didn't send men to stand on a stairwell landing at 3 o'clock in the morning because of a loan. She went back through the past 4 months in her mind, one encounter at a time, and realized that every other time, they had stood where she could see them and spoken where she could hear them because they wanted her to be afraid. A debt collector needed the debtor alive and still able to work. Last night had been different. Last night, no one had called her name. No one had said a single word to her. She tried to think of anything she had done differently during the past several days, and nothing came to her until she remembered the morning she'd spent 2 hours in the waiting room at the Social Security office. She remembered the form. She remembered the final line, the one asking about the possessions the deceased had left behind. And she remembered writing an honest sentence because she didn't know how else to answer. She stood, went into the bedroom, and pulled open the bottom drawer of the nightstand. The phone was lying inside beneath a folded sweater. A crack ran diagonally across the screen from the upper left corner almost to the center. The same crack it had carried since the day Wesley dropped it at the workshop and laughed, saying it didn't matter because it still worked. She had kept it for 4 months. She hadn't added any credit, removed the card, or touched it. Once a month, she plugged it in to charge, then put it away again, and she had never asked herself why. She carried it into the kitchen and sat down on the floor with her back against a cabinet door and her legs stretched out in front of her. She plugged it in. The screen came to life slowly, revealing the old background image, a blurred photograph of someone's backyard that she could no longer remember. Then the voicemail icon appeared in one corner of the screen. One unheard message. The date beneath it was the date of his last day. She stared at those words for a long time. She knew the message was there. She had known since the first week, when she turned on the phone for the first time and saw it, then immediately shut it off again. For 4 months, she had worked 2 shifts every day, recorded every last cent in her rubber-covered notebook, and climbed up and down the iron staircase 4 times a day. And throughout all that time, she had never once found the courage to press it, because as long as she didn't listen, Wesley was still the man who had left the house that morning carrying the lunch she'd packed for him. Once she listened, he would forever become the man trapped inside those final 11 seconds. She sat on the kitchen floor until the sunlight crept as far as the door handle. Then she placed a hand on her belly, lowered her head, and quietly told the baby inside that Mommy was sorry, but she had to listen to this. She pressed the button. The first second was nothing but wind. It was a powerful rush of wind, the sound it made through an open car window, with the steady hum of an engine beneath it. Then came a soft rustling, the kind of sound a phone made when it rubbed against clothing, which meant it had been inside his breast pocket, and the call had been placed by accident rather than deliberately. At the 4th second, a train whistle sounded in the distance, long and low, echoing from somewhere below, the whistle everyone who lived near the freight yards heard before dawn. At the 7th second, the wind thinned, and a man's voice spoke very close to the phone, so close that she could hear his breath before the words came. In the calm tone someone might use to greet a friend outside a diner, the voice said, "Get out, Wes. It's only a short walk. Just a few words, and then I'll have someone drive you home." Then it ended. 11 seconds. The automated voice asked whether she wanted to listen again. Delaney sat motionless on the kitchen floor, still holding the phone with the cracked screen, and she didn't replay it. She didn't need to, because in the past 4 months, there had been exactly one time when she had invited a stranger into her home, poured him a glass of water, and sat across from him at the same table just 2 steps from where she was sitting now, while he told her in that same calm voice that he was deeply sorry about her husband and that there were a few minor documents he needed her to sign. She took the rubber-covered notebook from her coat pocket and removed the elastic band. She didn't have to search for long, because the first page was the one she'd written during that first week, when she still believed she was doing something proper and responsible by recording the collector's name and the amount she paid so she could check the figures later. She had written the name on the top line in blue ballpoint pen, each letter neat, along with the rank he'd given himself while sitting at her kitchen table. Beneath it were 4 payment entries, and on the final line was the number 25. She sat staring at that name, and inside her mind, everything fell into place with an ease that was almost cruel. The investigation into her husband's accident had been closed after 3 days. She had called twice to ask about it, and both times, she'd been told that everything was clear and there was nothing further to investigate. The man who had signed off on that file was the same man who rang her doorbell the morning after the funeral, stood there with his hat in his hands, told her how sorry he was about her husband, sat in the chair across from her, drank the glass of water she poured for him, then removed the first document from his briefcase and explained that Wesley had left several outstanding debts and that he would try to help her arrange everything as gently as possible. She had thanked him. She remembered clearly that she had thanked him. At noon that day, she called Elias, the first call she had ever made to him, and said only one sentence. "Come over. I have something." He arrived within 20 minutes. She didn't invite him to sit. She placed the notebook and the phone with the cracked screen on the kitchen table, pointed to the name on the first page, and recounted those 11 seconds in the flat voice of someone who had repeated the story to herself too many times in a single morning. She didn't play the recording again. She said she would never play it in front of anyone. Elias stood across the table, staring at the name, and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked whether she was certain about the train whistle. She said she was. "Then I know where it happened," he said. He told her to pack a few things and leave that night, to go to Marisol's home in Pawtucket, and she agreed without arguing once, which worried him more than anything else. Late that afternoon, Marisol arrived in her old car to collect her, and they drove north across the bridge spanning the river at the edge of the city, the shortest route and the same one Wesley had always taken home from the shipyard. Night had just fallen. The bridge had only 2 traffic lanes and a narrow pedestrian walkway on the right, and 3 streetlights near the middle were broken. The car behind them turned on its headlights from closer than normal. Marisol looked into the rearview mirror and said nothing. She merely tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The car didn't pass. It maintained the same distance for a long stretch, then moved closer, then closer still. And when they reached the middle of the bridge, a second car crept up alongside them in the left lane, matching their speed exactly and trapping them between the 2 vehicles. Marisol pressed the brake. All 3 cars stopped in the middle of the bridge. The headlights behind them remained on, shining directly into the rearview mirror and flooding the entire car with white light. Delaney sat motionless in the passenger seat with both hands cradling her belly, and she realized she was on that very stretch of road. The door of the car on the left opened. Roy Faulkner stepped out, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and stood between the 2 lanes with the air of a man waiting for a train. Then, a blue pickup truck appeared from the far end of the bridge, approaching slowly from the opposite direction, and stopped across the exit at its narrowest point. Elias stepped out. There was nothing in his hands. He closed the truck door, let both arms hang at his sides, and began walking toward the 2 beams of light, slowly and steadily, no faster than the ordinary pace of a man crossing a street. He walked directly into the center of that white glare without stopping, and he didn't say a word. The distance narrowed 1 step at a time, and as it did, Faulkner neither retreated nor advanced. Something else made him move. On the narrow pedestrian walkway to the right, a man walking his dog stopped and raised his phone. Then 2 young men at the northern end of the bridge raised theirs. Inside, the cars trapped behind them, windows rolled down, and 3 more glowing screens turned toward the center of the bridge. 6 cameras. No one shouted. They simply stood there and recorded. Faulkner looked around once, very slowly, and Elias saw the moment when he finished counting. Faulkner adjusted his collar, returned to his car, and backed off the bridge without saying a word to anyone. The car behind them reversed as well. Its headlights went dark. Delaney remained seated in the car at the center of the bridge, her hands still around her belly, looking at the man standing alone between the 2 empty lanes, and she understood that he wasn't what had driven them away. It was 6 strangers who had been willing to look. There were only 3 places in the city where the whistle of a freight train could be heard near dawn, and 2 of them were across the river, too far from the route Wesley Mercer took home from the shipyard. The remaining place was the old staging yard behind refrigerated warehouse number 7, where a dead-end track ran almost to the wall and where, for years, the grounds had been used only to park trucks overnight. It took Elias 2 days to obtain the yard's timesheets from that period, and another day to compare them with the list of people who had borrowed money from the organization that same year. Only one name appeared on both lists. Warren Osley was 43 years old, drove a refrigerated delivery truck, and no longer lived in Providence. He rented a small house near Woonsocket, almost an hour north of the city. Elias arrived alone that afternoon. The door opened, and the man inside saw him, and the first thing Elias noticed was that he didn't look surprised. He simply stood there with a dish towel still in one hand and said one sentence. "For 4 years I've left the porch light on all night." Then he stepped aside and opened the door wider. The kitchen smelled of food that was still cooking. A crayon drawing was attached to the refrigerator, with 3 names written in a child's hand: Dell, Pete, and Maribel. And when Osley saw Elias looking at it, he instinctively raised a hand to cover it, then lowered his hand again because he understood that hiding it would serve no purpose. He poured coffee for both of them and sat down, and he began speaking before Elias could ask a single question, because some stories were rehearsed inside a person's mind for 4 years while they waited for someone to sit across from them and listen. He said he'd borrowed $8,000 to pay for dental treatment and his youngest child's medical bills, and he had repaid more than half. He said someone called him out to the yard that night, handed him the keys to a different vehicle, not his delivery truck, and told him to drive to a meeting place, pick someone up, then head toward the bridge. That was all. If he did it, The remainder of his debt would be cleared. He said he asked whom he would be driving. They told him he didn't need to know. He said he sat in the vehicle for 10 minutes thinking. And during those 10 minutes, he thought about the debt, his 3 children, and how all he had to do was drive, that he wasn't actually doing anything, and in the end, he took the keys. I drove, that's all. There was no plea in his voice. I picked him up at the meeting place. He sat in the back seat. He even talked to me about the weather. Then someone told me to pull over before the bridge, get out, and walk somewhere else to wait. I walked away. I didn't look back. He set down his coffee. I didn't find out who I'd driven until the next morning. Elias said nothing. The man stood, went into another room, and returned with a shoebox. Inside were money order stubs arranged chronologically, the stack growing thicker with every passing year. Every payment had been sent to the same 4th floor address in Olneyville, and not one of them bore the sender's name. I send something every month, he said. Some months it's a lot. Some months I can only manage $40. When the company cuts my hours, I send less. I never dared put my name on it, not because I was afraid of them, but because I didn't know what to write in that box. Elias picked up one of the stubs and looked at the date. It was from 4 months earlier, after Wesley's death, after people had begun knocking on the 4th floor apartment door to collect money for a debt that no longer existed. He turned over several more. In some months, the amount sent was nearly equal to the amount being collected, except one arrived at the beginning of the month, and the other was taken at the end, and for the past 4 months, a woman had survived on the difference between those 2 figures. She still believed the money came from some distant relative on her husband's side. She had recorded it in her rubber-covered notebook under income, 1 line every month, and each time she wrote it down, she silently thanked someone whose face she had never seen. "Has she had the baby yet?" Warren Osley asked, and it was the only question he asked that entire afternoon. "Not yet. Soon." Osley nodded, looked down at the table for a while, then pushed the shoebox toward him. "Take it. Whatever you need from here, you can have." Then he straightened his back, rested both hands on the table, and spoke his final words in the voice of a man who had just set down something he'd carried for far too long. "You tell me where I need to go to tell this story, and I'll go. I can go right now. I can't sleep anymore, Mr. Bracco. It's been 4 years. Paula Reinhardt received him in a windowless room on the 4th floor of the federal building, and she didn't offer him coffee. She had been investigating the Bracco name for 6 years, and in all that time, she had never gathered enough evidence to place before a judge, so when the man himself called and asked for a meeting, she assumed it was some kind of game, and she said so plainly in her opening sentence. He didn't argue. He placed a hard drive on the table, a shoebox filled with 4 years of money order receipts, arranged in chronological order, a black hardcover notebook, and a sheet of paper bearing the name and address of a driver in Woonsocket who was waiting to be summoned. She opened the hard drive on her computer and examined its contents in silence for nearly 40 minutes. And when she looked up, her expression had changed. "What do you want?" "I'll take responsibility for the lending operation," he said, "from beginning to end. I won't blame anyone else." "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing. I'm asking only that you finish the Faulkner part before he has time to clean everything up." Reinhardt closed the computer and straightened in her chair. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Mr. Bracco, so you don't convince yourself otherwise later. I'm not doing you any favors. I don't feel sorry for you. I don't consider this redemption, and I won't say one good word about you in court." She rested one hand on the stack of documents. "I'm simply trading one man for a machine. You're the man. That machine has been grinding people down for 4.5 years. I come out ahead in that trade. That's all. I understand. You're going to prison." "I know." He spent the next 3 days putting everything else in order. He transferred every legitimate asset in his name into an irrevocable trust, one even he would never be able to reclaim, and he did it with 2 lawyers seated on either side of the table, until they had explained to him 3 separate times that once he signed, he would lose control of it forever. He signed anyway. Most of the trust was reserved for the 19 people named in the black notebook. The remainder was designated for purposes he specified on a single typed page that no one was permitted to read until his sentence took effect. He left nothing in his own name. On Friday morning, he went down to the garage to retrieve his car and turn himself in. 2 lights were broken in the garage, and the sound of several pairs of shoes echoed across the concrete from the direction of the exit, stopping and then moving again. He heard someone call his name from the darkness, and he didn't answer. He kept walking toward the light at the top of the ramp. For a brief moment, everything happened very quickly and at very close range. Fabric striking fabric, a heel sliding on oil, the leather briefcase being torn from his grasp and falling to the floor. Then he emerged onto the street alone, breathing heavily, his left hand pressing the hard drive tightly against his chest. No one followed him out of the darkness behind him, because it was daylight outside. And in daylight, there were people who could see. He walked all 3 blocks. His coat was torn at the elbow, but he continued straight ahead and didn't take a car. 4 television vans had been parked outside the federal building on Kennedy Plaza since early morning because word that a major case was about to be announced had leaked the night before, and the city had never been able to keep a secret for more than one night. Someone recognized him from about 60 feet away. A voice called his name. Then came the sound of running feet, and an entire row of cameras turned toward him at once. The sunlight that month was harsh and white, falling directly across the treeless plaza. Elias Bracco stopped before the revolving glass door. He placed the hard drive on the steps where everyone could see it. Then he straightened and raised both hands high, his palms open and facing forward, holding them there in broad daylight before 4 cameras and dozens of pedestrians who had stopped to watch. No one ordered him to do it. No one was pointing anything at him. He raised his hands of his own accord, and he kept them raised as he walked through the revolving door, crossed the lobby, and approached the 2 federal agents who came out to meet him in the center of the room, until one of them told him he could lower his hands now. 3 weeks earlier, beneath the misting rain in an alley in Olneyville, a woman had knelt before him and clasped her hands together to plead for an unborn child. That morning, beneath the sun and before the entire city, the man who had blocked her way out that night raised both of his hands and asked no one for anything. In the file he submitted to the prosecutors, there was a separate section, nearly 40 pages long, devoted entirely to Delaney Mercer, and every one of those pages constructed the same story. She had been coerced from beginning to end. She had never known whom she was paying. Every contact between her and Elias had occurred against her will. He had arranged it carefully, the way someone built a wall, with every date aligned, every statement matching, and not a single opening where anyone could reach through. He worked on it for 3 nights in a row and didn't say one word to her. On the morning she appeared in court, his attorney was already waiting in the corridor to hand her a typed statement that she needed only to review and sign. She took the paper, read it from beginning to end, folded it in half, and handed it back. In the courtroom, when she was asked whether she had acted under threat, she remained silent for a moment before answering, and the entire room waited for her. "No," she said. "No one forced me." Reinhardt looked up from the file. The defense attorney straightened in his chair. At the defendant's table, Elias turned to look at her, and she didn't look back. "Please explain. The first night I met him, I didn't know who he was. That part is true." Her voice was steady and slow, not loud, but no one in the room had to strain to hear her. "But afterward, I knew. I knew his name. I knew what he did. I knew the lending operation belonged to his family. I knew all of that before I called him for the first time. And I called him anyway." She placed both hands on the table before her. "I opened my door and let him into my home. I gave him my notebook. I gave him my husband's phone. No one was standing behind me when I did those things. I did them myself, and I did them because I wanted someone to tell me how my husband died." She was asked whether she understood how damaging that testimony could be to her. "It's been explained to me," she said. "Then why are you still testifying this way?" She remained silent longer than before. "Because people have erased my name from everything my entire life," she said. "When I was a child, I lived in 4 different homes. Each one wrote my name on a piece of paper and then crossed it out again. I worked for nearly a year in a building where people passed me every day, and not one of them ever read the badge on my uniform. My husband died, and his file was closed after 3 days. They wrote his name on one line and shut it away. I paid money for 4 months toward a debt that didn't exist, and my name in their notebook was nothing more than a line they used to collect money." She looked up. "This is the first thing in my life that I chose for myself. I won't let anyone erase my name from it again, including him." She sat down. No one applauded. No one spoke. And in that silence, Elias lowered his head and looked at his hands resting on his thighs. The cost came that same week. Because she had testified that she acted voluntarily, her application for the Federal Witness Protection Program was returned, and she was told very politely that the program was intended for people who had been threatened, not for someone who admitted she had made her own choice. Her application for survivor benefits, filed several months earlier, was also suspended for review because her testimony raised questions about the source of the money she had received over the previous 4 years. The laundry where she worked during the day received 2 calls from people asking why one of its employees was appearing in the newspapers, and by the end of the month, she no longer had any shifts there. She left the courthouse with exactly what she had carried inside: a cloth bag, a rubber-covered notebook, and a name the entire city now knew. The sentence was handed down 2 weeks later. Elias Bracco received 7 years in federal prison for offenses connected to the lending operation, a harsher sentence than someone who had surrendered voluntarily and turned over all the evidence might reasonably have hoped for. And while delivering the sentence, the judge noted that a witness's testimony had eliminated the mitigating circumstances the defense had attempted to establish. Elias didn't appeal. Roy Faulkner was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, after the driver from Woonsocket testified for 2 full sessions, and 11 of the 19 people named in the Black Notebook agreed to take the stand. At the end of that winter, while the sky was still dark and snow had gathered in dirty ridges along the curb, Marisol Vega drove Delaney to Women and Infants Hospital on Dudley Street in her old car. She supported her all the way down the corridor, pushed open the double doors at the far end, and remained outside when they closed again. She sat on a row of plastic chairs in the waiting room, still wearing her blue-gray uniform because she had come directly from the night shift, and she remained there for a very long time. When the windows at the end of the corridor began to turn pale gray, the door opened, and Marisol Vega stepped into the hallway, with a baby wrapped in a white blanket in her arms. She lowered her eyes to the child and whispered in her own language, "Hello, little one. So you've arrived." He was assigned to the woodworking shop at Fort Devens, and he accepted the position without requesting a transfer, because it required his hands to remain busy and left little empty space for his hands and mind. He built desks and chairs for schools throughout the region. He learned all over again how to plane a piece of wood until its surface was smooth, and during his first year, he ruined more than he finished. By the autumn of that year, he asked the prison administration for permission to hold an evening class in the common room, teaching reading and writing to the men who couldn't understand the notices posted on the walls, and they agreed because no one else wanted the responsibility. 3 men attended the first session, 14 came to the 10th. He taught them how to spell, how to write applications, and how to fill in the boxes on forms that they had spent their entire lives asking someone else to complete for them. The hardest part of the class wasn't the reading or writing. It was persuading a 40-year-old man to sit down and admit that he couldn't read. Elias knew why that was so difficult. He had seen the careful handwriting on a sheet of graph paper, and he understood the cost of having to ask your wife to write a letter for you. The trust began making payments that spring, following the instructions he had written on the typed page the day before he turned himself in. The 19 people named in the Black Notebook didn't receive cash. They received startup capital, an employment contract, and priority for contracts at 3 buildings in which the trust still held an interest. 14 refused because they were afraid. 5 accepted. The first letter arrived near the end of the winter of his first year, in an envelope bearing an ordinary stamp, with handwriting he recognized before he even opened it. She kept it brief. She didn't ask how he was, or tell him her troubles. She wrote that she had signed her first contract with a bakery on Broadway Street, cleaning 3 evenings a week, and that she had read every line carefully before signing, and this time, she hadn't agreed to work at a loss. At the end, she wrote only 1 sentence about the baby. Her name was Josie. He read the letter 3 times and placed it in a cardboard folder. The second arrived the following summer. She wrote that the company now had a name, Mercer and Associates, and employed 4 people, all women who had once worked night shifts in office buildings throughout the city, 2 of whom had names in the notebook he knew. Marisol Vega was the first person listed on the payroll. Delaney wrote that she cried when she signed, then spent the entire afternoon complaining that the desk didn't fit properly. In the 3rd year, the letter told him she was taking an evening accounting course at the community college twice a week and had failed her first class. She even included the grade. In the 4th year, she wrote about negotiating a contract with a property management company. They asked whether she intended to stand by that price, and she told them she did. In the 5th year, the letter was longer than any that had come before. Mercer and Associates had won the contract to clean the entire Weybosset Tower. She didn't write a single word about the time she had pushed garbage carts through the utility corridors of that same building. She merely copied, word for word, clause number 7 from the contract she had drafted. a provision the other party questioned twice because they had never seen anything like it in a cleaning contract. Every employee had to be addressed by their first name, never by a shift number or job title, and each name had to be printed on a badge large enough to read from 2 steps away. They asked her why. She wrote that she didn't explain. In the 6th year, the letter said Josie had started 1st grade, that she was afraid of the hand dryers in public restrooms, and that one day she drew a man welding an iron staircase, though Delaney had no idea where the image had come from, then asked her mother who he was. She didn't write what answer she gave. He read every letter twice and kept them all. He replied regularly, and his letters were brief as well. He never asked whether she intended to visit. Twice, she suggested coming. The first time was during his 2nd year, and the second was during his 5th. Both times, he wrote back telling her not to come because the journey was long and she was busy. He never offered any further explanation. Not once. Inside the prison, the men said Bracco was a strange one, receiving letters regularly while going 7 years without a single visitor. Some guessed he was ashamed. Some believed he was arrogant. Others said the woman had probably married someone else long ago and wrote only out of courtesy. As for Elias, every time he put pen to paper to refuse her, he wrote the sentence quickly and kept it short, then sealed the envelope immediately, and he never read that letter again. On the morning he walked out through the gates of Fort Devens, the sky was clear and the air was cold, and the person waiting for him in the parking lot wasn't the one he had expected. Toby Bracco was 15 years old now, tall enough that Elias had to look up at him, standing beside an old car with a ring of keys in one hand and the awkward expression of someone who didn't know whether to offer a handshake or an embrace. In the end, he chose both, clumsily, and Elias let him choose. "Mom told me to come. I only have my learner's permit, so don't tell Grandma." On the drive home, they remained silent for nearly an hour. Not the heavy kind of silence, but the silence that came from knowing there was no way to fit 7 years into one conversation without cheapening them. When they reached the road along the river, the boy spoke first. "Uncle Elias, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "She never came to visit you, did she?" "No. I know why now." He kept his eyes on the road. "Last year, I did a civics assignment about the federal prison system. I read that every visitor has to provide a name, address, identification number, and relationship to the prisoner, and that the record is kept. People can search it. Lawyers can search it. Even outsiders can find ways to search it." Elias looked out the window and said nothing. "Faulkner is serving life, but not all his people went to prison," Toby said. "For the past 7 years, if her name had appeared in that record, then anyone who wanted to know what she was to you could have found out if they looked hard enough. But if her name wasn't recorded anywhere, then she was only a cleaner who opened her own company. She had nothing to do with you." The boy glanced at him. "You weren't pushing her away. You were hiding her." Elias remained silent, and that silence was his answer. During those 7 years, he'd had nothing left with which to protect anyone. No money, no people, not even a name that still carried value. The only thing he had left was his own absence, and he had used it to build a wall around the mother and daughter. Each letter of refusal, another brick, placed one at a time without ever telling her what he was building. They entered the city after noon. Westminster Street was busier than he remembered, and there were storefronts he didn't recognize. In the middle of the row stood a small shop with words painted by hand across the glass in dark blue edged with white, the lettering neat and careful, written by someone who worked slowly and didn't want to make a mistake. "Mercer and Daughter Cleaning Services." He told Toby to wait in the car. Elias stood outside the glass door holding a small wooden box he had made himself in the prison workshop, walnut with brass hinges, its interior sanded until it was smooth as silk. Inside was an old phone with a crack running diagonally across the screen. Delaney stood behind the counter with a young woman wearing a new uniform. She was showing the woman how to fasten the name badge to her shirt, doing it carefully, straightening it, then stepping back to make sure it was level. He watched her, and he understood that everything inside that room had been built by her own hands, one piece at a time, during the 7 years he had been gone. All he had done was repair a staircase. The door flew open, and a 6-year-old girl with brown hair tied into 2 ponytails poked her head outside and regarded him with the frank curiosity of a child. "Mister, you've been standing out here for a long time. Are you going to buy something?" "Josie, come back inside." Delaney looked up from behind the counter, and she went perfectly still. For one long moment, they looked at each other through the glass, bearing her painted name. Then she walked around the counter, came through the door, and he embraced her the way a man embraced someone he had never allowed himself to hope he would hold again. The wooden box was caught between them, and neither of them cared. Some people pass us every day. They clean the floors beneath our feet, clear the tables where we sit, and hold open the doors we walk through. Yet we never once read the name badges on their uniforms. A person isn't treated as invisible because they aren't there, but because no one is willing to look. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop and read a single name correctly for an entire life to take a different path. If this story has left something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can listen to more unforgettable stories together every day. How did Delaney and Elias's story make you feel? And if you were in their place, what would you choose? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear the deepest feelings in your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.